The Miami sun beat down on the Port Boulevard with a relentless heat that made the asphalt feel like a furnace beneath my feet. I stood there, 32 years old and exhausted, clutching 4 heavy suitcases, while my family stood in the shade of the terminal awning. Sweat trickled down my neck, soaking into the collar of my department store blouse, a piece I had bought on clearance for $15. I looked at the boarding pass in my hand, a simple economy ticket that represented my supposed place in this family. For years I had played the role of the invisible sister, the quiet administrative assistant who paid the bills while they chased shadows of fame. My sister Shantel stepped forward with a sneer that twisted her face into something unrecognizable. She did not say a word at first. She simply snatched the boarding pass from my trembling fingers. Before I could protest, she ripped the paper into tiny white pieces, letting them fall like confetti onto the dirty pavement. She told me that I did not belong on this trip, and that I was far too plain to be seen on her social media feed. Shantel announced to everyone standing in line that she had invited Jalen, her personal trainer, to take my spot because he had the right look for the photos she planned to take. She called me an embarrassment and said my presence would only bring down the luxury aesthetic they were trying to project. The crowd around us began to murmur, and I saw several elderly women in colorful sun hats shaking their heads in disapproval. They looked at Shantel with eyes full of judgment, whispering about the lack of home training and respect in the younger generation. Their quiet tisking sounds filled the air, but Shantel did not care. She continued to bark insults at me, her voice rising to a shrill pitch that echoed off the concrete walls. I felt the sting of humiliation, a sharp heat in my chest that was far worse than the Florida sun. I turned to my husband Deon, hoping to find a shred of loyalty in his eyes. We had been married for 7 years, and I had supported him through every failed business venture and every empty promise. Deon did not look at me with sympathy. Instead, he reached for his own wrist and began to unbuckle the Rolex watch I had bought him for our last anniversary. I had worked 60 hours a week for months to save the $5,000 for that timepiece. Deon handed the watch to Jalen, the muscular young man standing smugly beside my sister. Deon told me that Jalen actually looked like he belonged in a first-class lounge, whereas I looked like I belonged in the laundry room. He said that since I was going back to our small apartment, I would have no need to keep track of the time. The betrayal was a cold blade through my heart. I watched Jalen strap my hard-earned gift onto his wrist, while my brother-in-law Terrence laughed in the background. My own husband had just stripped me of my dignity to please a stranger. A port security guard, a tall man with a stern expression, stepped forward and gripped my arm. He told me that since I no longer had a valid ticket, I was trespassing on private property. He began to forcefully lead me away from the terminal toward the public bus stop. Shantel blew me a mocking kiss as I was dragged off. In that moment, the pain died, and a chilling clarity took its place. I watched them walk toward the ship, unaware that the ground beneath their feet was mine. I was no longer the sister they could discard. I was the storm they were about to walk into. The chaos at the main terminal was reaching a fever pitch as I stood by the dusty curb. Shantel and Terrence led the group toward the exclusive VIP entrance, their heads held high with unearned arrogance. They ignored the velvet ropes and the clear signs indicating that only suite guests were allowed. Shantel began to scream at a young female attendant who tried to block her path. She claimed that her family was far too important to wait in the heat with the common folk. Terrence shook his empty wallet at the staff, demanding to speak to a manager, and causing a scene that made other passengers stop and stare in disbelief. Deon stood behind them, looking bored and indifferent to the spectacle his own family was making. The security team quickly intervened, firmly informing them that their tickets were for the lowest economy tier located near the engine room. They were forced to retreat, grumbling and cursing back to the end of a line that stretched for 3 city blocks. As I stood alone in the blistering sun, 3 jet-black Cadillac Escalades with tinted windows pulled up to the curb beside me. The engines hummed with a quiet power that commanded attention. The doors opened in unison, and 5 men in tailored dark suits stepped out. They were led by the chief executive officer of the Aurora Zenith, a man I had personally hired for his efficiency and discretion. The port security guard who had been dragging me away suddenly froze his grip on my arm, loosening as he realized the importance of the men approaching. The executive team did not look at the shouting crowd or the long lines of tourists. They walked straight to me, removed their sunglasses, and bowed their heads with profound respect. The CEO spoke in a clear voice that carried across the pavement, welcoming me back and calling me Madam Chairperson. My mind raced as I looked at the shocked faces of the people nearby. For 5 years, I had maintained the ultimate lie. I was not the struggling secretary they thought I was. I had quietly acquired the controlling interest in Zenith Hospitality and this very cruise ship after the market crash half a decade ago. I had hidden my vast wealth and my true identity because I desperately wanted to find a love that was not built on bank accounts or stock portfolios. I wanted to know if Deon loved Nia the woman or Nia the billionaire. Today, I had my answer. Every sacrifice I made and every humble act I performed had been met with greed and cruelty. They did not want a partner. They wanted a servant to foot the bill. The hotel director gestured toward a private glass-enclosed elevator labeled for the owner only. I did not look back at the terminal where my family was still arguing with the staff over the price of bottled water. I straightened my shoulders and felt the weight of my authority return to me like a familiar cloak. I told the CEO that I wanted a full report on the guests in cabin 412, which was the cramped room assigned to Shantel and Deon. I walked through the private entrance, the cool air conditioning of the ship hitting my face like a benediction. The game of shadows was over, and the era of consequences had begun. They had no idea that the woman they just discarded actually held the keys to their entire world. The doors to the owner's loft opened to reveal a sanctuary that spanned over 3,000 square feet of pure elegance. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Atlantic Ocean, and the scent of fresh white lilies filled the air. My private butler stood ready, offering a crystal glass of chilled, sparkling water on a silver tray. This was my world, a place of silence and absolute control. Meanwhile, far below the waterline in the bowels of the ship, my family was experiencing a very different reality. I had personally authorized the relocation of their reservations to 2 cramped interior cabins on Deck 2. Those rooms were originally designed as storage closets and had no windows to let in the light. They were situated directly beneath the main disco floor, where the thumping bass of the music would vibrate through their thin walls until the early hours of the morning. While I rested on Egyptian cotton sheets, Shantel, Deon, and Terrence would be fighting for space in a room that barely had enough floor area for their suitcases. I decided to visit the Diamond Lounge for a quiet moment before dinner. As I sat in a plush velvet armchair, I noticed an older woman watching me from across the room. She was elegant, with silver hair styled in a perfect crown and a string of pearls that glowed against her deep mahogany skin. This was Mrs. Etta, a legendary figure in the world of black business who had retired after building a real estate empire from nothing. She did not need to see my bank balance to recognize who I was. She walked over with a graceful confidence and sat in the chair beside me. Mrs. Etta looked down through the glass mezzanine at the main lobby, where she could see Shantel and Shantel's loud group causing another scene with the concierge. Their voices were muffled by the glass, but their aggressive gestures and disrespectful behavior were visible to everyone in the high-tier section. Mrs. Etta turned her gaze back to me and asked if I knew the people making such a disgraceful noise in such a beautiful place. I felt a momentary surge of old shame, the kind that had kept me quiet for far too many years. I looked her in the eye and admitted that they were indeed my family. I told her that I had spent my whole life trying to earn their love and trying to carry their burdens on my own back. Mrs. Etta reached out and placed a firm, warm hand on mine. Her eyes were full of a wisdom that only comes from decades of surviving the storms of life. She told me that a person cannot choose their relatives, but they must choose their company. She spoke a sentence that felt like it was etched into my soul. Mrs. Etta told me to never let blood ties clip my wings. She whispered that eagles do not fly with turkeys, and if I continued to stay on the ground to make them feel comfortable, I would eventually forget how to soar. She said that some people are committed to being small, and they will always hate the person who reminds them of their own lack of height. I realized then that my silence was not a virtue, it was a cage. I thanked her for the confirmation I had been seeking my entire adult life. The heavy chains of obligation began to crack. I was the owner of this ship, and I was finally ready to be the owner of my own destiny. The Grand Horizon dining room was a masterpiece of gold leaf and crystal chandeliers, but I viewed it from the secluded comfort of the captain's alcove. I sat with Mrs. Etta behind a large pane of one-way glass, a vantage point that allowed us to see every detail of the main floor without being spotted. I watched as my family entered the room looking like a collection of neon signs in a graveyard. Shantel wore a dress covered in cheap sequins that caught the light in all the wrong ways, while Terrence sported a bright purple suit that screamed for attention he did not deserve. They marched toward the head waiter with an air of unearned royalty, demanding the premier table overlooking the grand staircase. The waiter, a professional I had trained myself, checked his tablet and calmly informed them that their economy status did not qualify for center seating. He led them, much to their vocal disgust, to a small, wobbly table tucked in the back corner, right next to the swinging doors of the kitchen and the constant scent of the restrooms. Terrence was visibly fuming, his face turning a dark shade of frustration as he sat down. To save his pride in front of Jalen and the rest of the family, he snapped his fingers at a sommelier and demanded the most expensive bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon on the list. He was playing the role of the big spender, bragging loudly enough for the neighboring tables to hear about his supposed business triumphs. I watched him pour the wine with a flourish, oblivious to the fact that the very lifestyle he was flaunting was built on a foundation of sand. For years, I had quietly managed a secret sub-account that fed money into Terrence's business ventures to keep my sister's household afloat. Before I boarded this ship, I had logged into the system and frozen every single one of those transfers. I had cut the umbilical cord of my charity, and it was time for them to feel the cold. When the check arrived at the end of the meal, the bill totaled $485. Terrence pulled out a gold-plated credit card and handed it to the waiter with a smug grin. I watched through this glass as the waiter swiped the card once, then twice, and then a third time. Each time, the machine emitted a sharp red flash. The waiter leaned in and whispered that the card had been declined. The silence at the table was sudden and deafening. Shantel was the first to break it, her voice rising into a shrill scream that caused other diners to turn around in shock. She accused the waiter of being incompetent and claimed the ship's machinery was broken. She insulted his heritage and his job, making a scene so ugly that even the security guards began to move toward their section. Terrence tried a second card and then a third, but I had been thorough in my preparations. Every line of credit they had that was linked to my assets was dead. Deon sat there looking embarrassed, finally forced to reach into his own pocket. He had to pull out every crumpled $20 bill he had, counting them out one by one like a child paying for candy. Jalen did not even look up from his phone. He sat there scrolling through his social media feed, refusing to offer a single cent to help the people who had brought him on this trip. I sat back in my velvet chair and took a slow sip of my jasmine tea. There was a flicker of satisfaction in my heart, but it was overshadowed by a deep, aching pity. I realized that these people were not just cruel, they were profoundly ignorant. They had mistaken my kindness for weakness for so long that they had forgotten how to survive without it. The morning sun over Jamaica was a brilliant gold as the ship docked at the pier in Falmouth. My phone vibrated on the marble nightstand with a message from Shantel. She was still under the impression that I had somehow managed to sneak onto the ship using a discarded ticket and was hiding in the lower decks. Her text message was a masterclass in deception, claiming that she felt guilty for our argument at the port. She invited me to meet the family at what she called a secret, pristine beach on the outskirts of the city. She provided a set of coordinates that I knew very well were not for a beach, but for a desolate industrial landfill located 2 hours away from the tourist zones. Shantel even suggested that I take a local shared taxi to save money, knowing the route was dangerous and filthy. She wanted me to spend my day standing in the middle of a mountain of trash while she enjoyed the island paradise. I did not reply to her message. Instead, I made a single phone call to the concierge desk. Within 20 minutes, a private Mercedes was waiting at the gangway to whisk me away to a secluded helipad. While Shantel and the rest of the family were piling into a cramped, rusted minibus with broken air conditioning, I was being strapped into the leather seat of a state-of-the-art Eurocopter. I told the pilot that I wanted a full aerial tour of the coastline, specifically focusing on the main road leading toward the Northern District. I wanted to see the island from a perspective they could never afford, a view that was reserved for the few who actually owned the horizon. The climax of the afternoon arrived as we hovered over a stretch of highway that was paralyzed by a massive traffic jam. The heat rising from the road was visible in shimmering waves, and there, stuck in the middle of the chaos, was the tattered blue minibus carrying my family. I could see Shantel through the open window, her face glistening with sweat and her expensive makeup smearing under the humidity. Jalen was beside her, fanning himself with a piece of cardboard, looking miserable in the stagnant air. I instructed the pilot to descend to an altitude of 60 feet, hovering directly alongside the bus. I sat by the window wearing a pair of designer sunglasses that cost more than their entire cruise fare, holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne. I leaned toward the glass and gave them a slow, deliberate wave. The downdraft from the powerful rotor blades sent a massive cloud of red dust and roadside debris swirling through the open windows of their bus. I saw Terrence cover his eyes and Deon cough as the grit filled the cabin. Shantel looked up, her eyes widening in a mixture of shock and denial. For a split second, our gazes locked. I saw the recognition in her face, followed immediately by a shake of her head. She turned to Deon and shouted that it was impossible, that it must simply be a wealthy tourist who happened to look like her pathetic sister. They could not conceive of a world where I was the one looking down on them. I took a calm sip of my drink and signaled the pilot to rise. As we climbed toward the clouds, the minibus became a tiny, insignificant speck in the dust, exactly where they had tried to leave me. The night air on the ocean was cold and unforgiving, much like the truth I was about to uncover. I sat in the darkened command center of my suite, the glow of the security monitors illuminating my face. With a few deliberate keystrokes on my laptop, I accessed the master administrative system for the cabin locks. I located the entry for room 212 and officially revoked the access rights for the key card belonging to Deon. I watched the screen as my husband approached the door at 2 o'clock in the morning, looking exhausted and disheveled from a night of heavy drinking with Terrence. He swiped his card against the electronic reader, but instead of the usual green light, a steady red glow stared back at him. He tried again and again, his frustration growing with every failed attempt. He began to pound his fist against the heavy metal door, calling out for Shantel to let him in. Inside the room, the hidden microphones picked up a conversation that made my blood run cold. Shantel and Jalen were not asleep. They were sitting on the edge of the narrow bed, counting a stack of cash and laughing. I heard Shantel tell Jalen that they did not need to worry about the debt from this trip because she had a plan. She said that as soon as they returned to Miami, she would help Deon pressure me into selling my 10-year-old car and emptying the last $12,000 from our joint savings account. Shantel whispered that Nia was weak and would do anything to keep her family together. Deon's voice finally came through the door, muffled but desperate, begging to be let in because the hallway was freezing. I watched as Jalen smirked and told Shantel to ignore him for a while longer. Jalen said that Deon was a useful idiot but a bore to be around. Then I heard my husband's response from the other side of the door, a confession that severed the last thread of my mercy. Deon shouted that if they let him in now, he promised to finalize the divorce papers by next month. He told them he had already started siphoning money from our retirement fund to invest in Jalen's new fitness gym. He called me a boring, invisible woman who was only good for a paycheck and a place to sleep. He laughed and said that once the money was gone, he would leave me with nothing but the clothes on my back. The sheer audacity of their betrayal was staggering. I watched Deon eventually give up his assault on the door. He slumped down against the cold industrial carpet of the hallway, shivering as the powerful air conditioning system blew icy air over his huddled form. There were no blankets and no pillows, only the hard floor of a corridor that smelled of floor wax and sea salt. He looked small and pathetic, a man who had traded his soul for the approval of people who did not even like him. At 6 o'clock in the morning, a heavy-set member of the cleaning crew bumped into his legs with a vacuum cleaner, startling him awake. Deon scrambled to his feet, his face pale and his eyes bloodshot, looking like a beggar in a palace. I closed my laptop and felt a strange sense of peace. The man I thought I loved was a ghost, and I was finally ready to bury him. The moonlight ballroom was filled with the scent of expensive perfume and the quiet clinking of crystal glasses as the elite passengers gathered for the annual charity auction. I sat in a secluded booth draped in heavy velvet curtains, hidden from the view of the main floor. My family had managed to slip through the doors, likely by lying to the attendants, and were now circling the room like sharks in shallow water. They were desperate to mingle with the wealthy guests, but Terrence was the most obvious in his efforts. He stood near the stage, adjusting the cuffs of his cheap suit and trying to catch the eye of every billionaire who walked past. He wanted to prove that he belonged in this world of private jets and offshore accounts, unaware that he was walking directly into a trap I had carefully set. The auctioneer stepped to the podium and announced the star item of the evening, a rare bottle of 1945 Cabernet Sauvignon from a private estate. The starting bid was $5,000. I caught the eye of a young, clean-cut waiter standing near the back of the room. With a subtle nod of my head, I gave him the signal. He raised his hand and bid $7,000. Terrence, seeing a mere server participating in an auction of this caliber, felt an immediate surge of ego. He barked out $10,000, looking around the room to ensure everyone saw his bravado. The waiter, following my silent instructions, immediately countered with $15,000. Mrs. Etta, who was sitting just a few feet away from Terrence, leaned over and whispered loud enough for him to hear. She commented that the young waiter seemed to have more financial courage than the gentleman in the room. She wondered aloud if Terrence actually had the funds to keep up with a member of the service staff. The insult hit Terrence exactly where I knew it would. His face turned a deep, angry red as he shouted $20,000. The back and forth continued, the tension rising with every heartbeat. Every time Terrence thought he had won, the waiter would calmly raise his hand again. Finally, driven by a blind, frantic need to save his pride, Terrence bellowed $35,000. The room went silent as the auctioneer struck the gavel for the third time. Terrence stood tall, a triumphant smirk on his face, until the head of finance for the cruise line stepped forward with a mobile payment terminal. He politely informed Terrence that for a bid of this size, an immediate verification of assets was required before the bottle could be released. Terrence's smirk vanished as he realized his credit cards were already useless. He began to sweat his eyes, darting around the room in a panic. He was forced to step into the hallway and call his elderly parents on speakerphone. I heard him screaming at them, demanding that they sell the family's remaining parcel of land in Georgia immediately to cover the cost. His father's voice, frail and trembling, came through the phone, revealing that they were already 6 months behind on the mortgage because Terrence had been stealing from their retirement accounts for years. The entire facade of his success crumbled in minutes, exposing the rot beneath. Terrence had won the bottle, but in doing so, he had stripped his parents of their last bit of security and exposed his own cowardice to the world. I watched from the shadows, feeling no guilt, only the cold satisfaction of justice. The Azure Serenity Spa was a place of marble floors and soft flute music designed for the ultimate relaxation of the wealthy. I was reclining in a plush white robe, waiting for my scheduled massage, when I saw Shantel and Jalen enter the lounge area. They were whispering to each other, their eyes darting around the room, until they spotted my robe hanging on a brass hook near the sauna entrance. I watched through the reflection in a large silver mirror as Jalen pulled a small object from his pocket and slipped it into the deep pocket of my garment. Moments later, Shantel began to scream at the top of her lungs, claiming that her 2-carat diamond engagement ring had been stolen while she was in the steam room. She caused such a chaotic scene that the spa manager was forced to call the ship's chief of security. When the head of security arrived, a tall man named Miller, who knew exactly who I was, Shantel pointed a trembling finger at me. She told the crowd of high society women that I had always been jealous of her and that I was the only person who could have taken the jewelry. She demanded that Miller strip search me right there in the lobby to find the stolen prize, hoping to humiliate me in front of the very class of people I actually led. I remained perfectly calm, not moving a single muscle, as the spectators whispered and stared. I looked Miller directly in the eye and requested that he follow the standard protocol for a cross-check investigation. I suggested that since the accusation was so serious, everyone involved in the immediate vicinity should have their belongings inspected by the security team. Miller nodded and began the search. He reached into the pocket of my robe and pulled out a ring, but as soon as he held it up to the light, he shook his head. He announced that the item was a cheap piece of glass set in painted plastic, worth no more than $20 at a carnival. Shantel's face turned pale, but she tried to double down on her lie, claiming I must have swapped the real stone for a fake one. However, Miller did not stop there. He turned his attention to Shantel's oversized designer beach bag. Despite her loud protests and her attempts to pull the bag away, the security team performed a thorough search. The result was a devastating blow to her remaining dignity. From the depths of her bag, Miller pulled out 4 large bottles of premium organic skin serum, 3 jars of gold leaf facial cream, and 2 thick plush towels thew with the gold thread of the Aurora Zenith logo. Shantel had been busy looting the spa's supply cabinet while Jalen kept watch. The total value of the stolen goods exceeded $800. The wealthy women in the lounge gasped in disgust, pulling their silk robes tighter, as if her presence was a disease. Miller did not show any mercy. He took out a formal citation board and began to write a criminal report for petty theft and filing a false police report. Shantel stood there, caught in her own trap, while the very people she wanted to impress looked at her with nothing but pure contempt. I simply closed my eyes and signaled for my massage to begin. The grand ballroom was a sea of silk diamonds and tuxedos for the final gala of the voyage. Thousands of crystal droplets on the chandeliers captured the light, creating an atmosphere of pure opulence. My family stood huddled in a dim corner near the service entrance, looking like a collection of broken dolls. Shantel wore a rented dress that was 2 sizes too small and wrinkled from being stuffed in a suitcase, while Deon and Terrence tugged at itchy collars of cheap polyester suits. They were scanning the room for celebrities, unaware that the main event was about to begin. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and silenced the room, announcing that it was time to introduce the visionary woman who owned the Zenith Hospitality Corporation. A single, powerful spotlight cut through the darkness, finding me as I stood at the top of the marble staircase. I was wearing a custom gown of midnight blue silk that cost $45,000, with a diamond necklace that shimmered like stars against my skin. Beside me, Mrs. Etta stood with her head held high, clapping her hands with a look of immense pride. As I walked down the stairs, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. I saw the moment Deon realized it was me. His glass of cheap punch slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. Shantel's jaw dropped so far it looked like it might unhinge. They stood frozen, paralyzed by the sight of the woman they had spent their lives belittling, now standing as the queen of the empire. I climbed the steps to the stage and took the silver microphone from the stand. I did not scream. I did not cry. My voice was as calm and cold as a winter morning. I looked directly into the eyes of my husband and my sister, who were now trembling under the gaze of the wealthiest people in the country. I told the audience that tonight was a night for transparency and the settling of old debts. With a simple click of a remote in my hand, the massive digital screen behind me flickered to life. The first slide revealed a series of encrypted text messages between Deon and his lawyer, detailing his cold-blooded plan to drain my savings and finalize a divorce once he had secured my assets. The audience gasped as they read his words, calling me a pathetic checkbook. The second slide displayed a detailed spreadsheet of the gambling debts belonging to Shantel and Terrence, totaling over $200,000, all of which they had hidden from our parents while begging me for rent money. Finally, the third slide played a crystal-clear security video from the spa, showing Jalen and Shantel stuffed premium products into their bags and laughing about how easy it was to rob the rich. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of their shame. I looked at the crowd and then back at the wreckage of my family. I spoke clearly into the microphone, stating that I had used my hard-earned money to provide a safety net for these people for more than a decade. I had clothed them, fed them, and protected them from their own failures. But as of this moment, the charity bank known as NIA was officially closed for business. I announced that every account, every credit card, and every luxury they enjoyed at my expense was now terminated. I saw Deon crumble into a chair, his face white with terror, while Shantel tried to hide her face from the cameras. I was no longer their victim. I was the captain, and I was sailing away from their storm forever. The Aurora Zenith docked at the port of Miami under a gray morning sky that promised a cleansing rain. As the gangway lowered, I saw a group of men in dark windbreakers with the letters FBI printed in bold yellow across their backs. They were not there for a tour. I had spent the last 48 hours sending a digital trail of evidence to their field office, documenting every fraudulent loan and forged signature Terrence had used to fund his lifestyle. As Terrence stepped onto the pavement, his hands were shoved into metal cuffs before he could even take a breath of land air. He looked back at Shantel with a face full of terror, but she simply turned away, already looking for someone else to save her. I walked toward Deon, who was standing by our old suitcases with a desperate, pleading look in his eyes. He started to apologize, his voice trembling as he spoke about mistakes and second chances. I did not let him finish. I reached into my leather bag and pulled out the finalized divorce papers, throwing them directly at his chest. I told him that since he loved the Rolex so much, he should keep it, or better yet, give it to Jalen. I said that the two of them deserved each other and the empty life they were about to lead. Deon looked at the papers as they fluttered to the ground, realizing that his access to my world had been permanently revoked. I pulled out my phone and made one final call to my parents. I told them that the house they were living in, the one I had secretly bought from the bank to stop the foreclosure 3 years ago, had been sold to a new developer. I informed them that the surplus of $60,000 from the sale had been donated in their names to a local orphanage for children who actually appreciated their blessings. I told them they had exactly 30 days to pack their things and find a new place to live. Their screams of outrage echoed through the speaker, but I simply ended the call. I had spent my life being their crutch, and it was time they learned how to stand on their own. A long white limousine pulled up to the curb, and Mrs. Etta was already waiting inside. I stepped into the cool leather interior and did not look back. As the car began to pull away, I glanced through the tinted glass and saw Shantel and Deon screaming at each other on the sidewalk. They were literally fighting over a single $20 bill I had dropped on the ground so they could afford a bus ticket home. It was a pathetic sight, but it no longer held any power over me. I leaned back against the seat and felt a wave of absolute peace wash over me. It was not the revenge that made me smile. It was the realization that I was finally free. The weight of their expectations was gone, and for the first time in my life, I was breathing air that belonged only to me. This journey taught me that blood connects us, but loyalty defines us. For many years, I broke pieces of myself to keep my family whole, only to realize I was cutting myself on their broken shards. True dignity is not about the price of your clothes or the title on your door. It is about the boundaries you set and the respect you demand. To anyone holding on to toxic relationships out of a sense of obligation, I say, let go. You cannot heal in the same environment that made you sick. Your peace is expensive, so do not let anyone who cannot afford it sit at your table. As the sun sets on the horizon, I understand that my wealth was never about the millions of dollars in my bank account. It was about the courage to stand alone when being together meant being abused. I spent 32 years waiting for permission to be happy, but I finally realized that the key to the cage was always in my hand. We owe our families respect, but we do not owe them our souls. We do not owe them our silence when they treat us like footstools. The world is wide and full of people who will value you for the light you bring, not for the shadows you can carry for them. If you are currently sitting in the dark, wondering if you are enough, listen to my voice. You are more than enough. You are a masterpiece that they simply did not have the eyes to see. Walk away from the noise. Walk toward the peace. Your future is waiting for you to arrive without the heavy baggage of the past.